Now joined by Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane for a reaction on President Ramaphosa's speech during opening of Parliament. Mmusi, appreciate your time this afternoon. Your immediate reaction, thoughts to that opening address by President Ramaphosa?
Good afternoon, Hugo, and thank you so much for having me. There's very little to disagree with the President on, from the perspective that many of the 12 priorities that he put forward are things that are desperately needed. There's no country that doesn't want to create jobs, no country that doesn't want to build infrastructure, educate its kids, and make sure that the citizens are safe. So no one can deny the points that the President raised. The fundamental question that goes in is that two things. The first is, my reaction is that historically I've heard many of the things the President has said. The second thing is that we find ourselves in a scenario in this country where we have a government that is incapable of implementation. So we can solve, by creating a government of national unity, we can solve for unity and we can solve for politics. But that doesn't solve for unity of purpose, narrowing down of priorities, which is what I urge the President to do. Thirdly, ensuring that we've got the financial resources to deliver against. And lastly, I think if you are going to then, once you know all your priorities, you can ultimately ensure that you build the capability of the state to deliver against that. And I felt that there's no dialogue, there's no any of that that will solve for those fundamental things that actually keep a country on track. And so we have to now move away from just a government of national unity to a government of national execution, because it has to start doing things.
You're absolutely right, Mmusi, when you talk about the issues around execution. I want to touch on the narrowing down of priorities. What are those key priority areas that you feel that President Cyril Ramaphosa's government of national unity needs to focus on? And secondly, I'd imagine that, in fact, one of the opposition leaders spoke about how this address is very similar to multiple other addresses that President Cyril Ramaphosa has given. So he does talk about the right things, but the issue is that the right things are continually talked about year in, year out, and that issue of execution, which you raised, is never affected.
Yeah, I think the first thing that you've got to realize is that all policy occurs within a time period, right? We now living, as I explained to the President yesterday, that this decade that we're living in from 2020 to 2030 is going to be a decade defined by the geopolitics of this world, which means that the first thing we've got to do is ask ourselves the question, how do we transition South Africa from a fossil fuel to battery or sustainable energy? Imagine if South Africa became the battery center of the world, and that's not just the manufacturing of batteries, but transitioning into electric vehicles, etc., etc. Many people might scoff at that, but the truth is that means that you will have the minerals that go into that. That's a priority. Secondly, it means that you have to fix the logistics in this country, which means that goods can come in and out and South Africa can prepare itself as an export market. And then thirdly, it means that you can create the jobs that you are required to be able to do to fulfill that mandate. Whilst doing that, you are skilling young people for an economy that in fact exists. Because at this point in time, we're educating our young people for an economy that's passed. Many of them drop out and they are passing at 30%, which doesn't work. And then lastly, when you look at where South Africa is strategically positioned, it is almost as though God was smiling on us. In a world where there's crisis in the Middle East and everywhere else, the movement of goods has to now, South Africa is strategically well positioned for that. So we have to exploit that opportunity for its best and trade within Africa to make sure that we become that place where goods can move into Africa and a gateway into Africa. That is a narrowing down of priority that says public and private sector must all come towards one place. Civil society, business organizations need to focus on achieving that objective. That could be one of the lodestars, as we saw when we were thinking about the period leading up to 2010. All we had to do was focus on the World Cup. And then what we did is we borrowed to build infrastructure. We prioritized policing to make sure people were safe. So we can learn those lessons, because when South Africa actually has a unified goal, it works towards that. And I think for me, one is the economic role. The second is the educating of our young people so that the skills are tangibly being able to be sold. And then the third is about keeping us as citizens safe. It doesn't make sense to me that we have the largest cabinet and now over 2 billion rands has been given towards its own VIP protection, rather than in fact taking that same 2 billion rands and giving it to family and child centers or increasing the number of police that we have so that we in fact decrease the murder rate. Those, for me, would be the three narrow priorities that we can focus on.
So let's focus a little bit on education. And now you've suggested scrapping the 30% pass mark to improve educational outcomes. How would you address potential challenges such as resistance from educational institutions and the need for additional resources?
Well, I think there can be no doubt that the first argument to be made against even trade unions that are within the education sector is the fact that, in fact, 90% of the people that are unemployed are dropping out before they get to matric. Forcing them to pass at 30% means they are not going to compete with anyone in the job market. Secondly, that the jobs are moving to Kenya because Kenya's education system is starting to produce better outcomes than ours. So we have to, it becomes now a moral imperative even for the teacher unions to realize that their own kids are not going to make it. And so in an arm wrestle between government and teacher unions, the issues that the unions look at are not important. They are vital, but they cannot supersede the rights of the children where the education system is meant to bring them on board. So we have to, in collaboration with those institutions and others, and putting parents at the center of this issue, make sure that we fight for the educational issues. And I will not relent until we move this 30% pass mark off, because even though it might be seen as a side issue, but it speaks entirely to what the standard of education becomes, the lack of digitization, the lack of competitiveness that children have. The second is let's increase in the funding for the ECD. The president spoke about the Millennial Development Goals, of which one of them is education. Now, you can't do that if your children are not going to an ECD center in the main, because one of the objectives that have been set is that 10% of our budget spent on education needs to go to early childhood development. That would be 47 billion rands relative to the 0.1% that has been tabled at the moment. So if you do that exercise, you can make sure kids start school and finish school, and that more of them can read for meaning when they hit the age of 10, which is a priority. Otherwise, I can assure you, we can have all the dreams we like. We can sell people on anything. Without an educated population, I've never seen a nation develop. Japan proves the case. The Asian tigers prove the case. We don't have a choice as South Africa. We have to go through that, and we have to overinvest in education if we're going to, and cut other things. The thing about priorities is that if everything is a priority, then nothing is. What needs to happen is that we've got to say we're prioritizing on the following areas. And fair enough, others might suffer, like politicians, like the bureaucracy that sometimes is bloated in certain areas. Those things might suffer, but they suffer for the greater good of making sure that we can grow at least 3% so that we can deal with debt. We can at least ensure that we have a generation of young people that will surpass their parents. Because as things stand at the moment, I worry for South African parents that their children will be worse than they were. And for many circumstances, that's a very dangerous thought to put forward.
I'd imagine that many people feel exactly the same. Mmusi Maimane, BOSA leader, appreciate your time reacting to President Cyril Ramaphosa's opening of Parliament address.